Sustainable Tourism by Eric Weaver, Chapter 8, Relational Summary by T.H. Culhane. My first trip to the cultural landscape of the Pennsylvania Dutch, aka the Amish, was to visit a massive vertical farm in a greenhouse surrounded by pastures with grain silos and quaint red barns topped with photovoltaic solar panels, with people in 18th century garb going to and fro in horse carriages rimmed with LED lights. It's become a popular tourist destination, and every year I bring students from Envisage Mercy, the Mercy College Environmental Sustainability and Justice League, who drive 3.5 hours down from New York to see the modern-day miracle of how the Amish produce 7 to 20 times the amount of fresh salad greens and vegetables per acre all year round, with less than 20% of the water and with no pesticides, and best of all, with no soil. That means no soil erosion, no contamination with fertilizer, runoff causing eutrophication and fish kills and the collapse of riparian, lacustrine, and coastal ecosystems downstream. We got fresh, unpasteurized ice cream made from raw milk made from grass-fed cows, and attended rabbit and chicken and turkey auctions at local county fairs, surrounded by booths selling Trump hats and t-shirts and lawn signs and posters, urging us to make America great again by putting America's first female presidential candidate behind bars. Make America great again by going back to the 19th century? But which 19th century is this? The one in the alternative steampunk universe of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, where we all did vertical aeroponic farming on an industrial scale? The ecologically conscious Amish and English non-Amish guides, who gave us the tour of the impressive Aero Farm, showed us a massive trailing tomato vine that was 5 years old and still growing and producing organic fruit after 5 winters throughout the winter, and showed how they pulled lettuce heads right out of the tower garden and then popped them in a plastic bag, roots and all, without needing to wash them because there is no dirt and they've never been sprayed by anything toxic. And, best of all, they don't need to be refrigerated because they are, they told us, still alive and will keep growing and stay fresh without refrigeration as they're trucked up to New York to the market and after you get them home. Given that 40 to 60% of America's produce has to be thrown away before it even gets to the market, much of it because it spoils on the way, even while costing the consumer enormous amounts of money because of the cost of refrigeration, this solution of shipping living vegetables is so innovative, it sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, not something out of the past. We learned on the tour that a box of this aeroponic lettuce had been left in the trunk of a car on a hot summer day for 3 days, and when they opened it, the lettuce was still growing and was crisp and tasty. So if a trip to the hydroponics section of the land pavilion of Disney's Epcot Center theme park is supposedly a voyage into some vague simulacrum of Tomorrowland, the trip to Amish country is a trip into the reality of postmodern hybridity, where offstage and onstage cultural and market forces are shaping a whole new reality. Weaver says about the Amish Lancaster County and other cultural landscapes on page 133, quote, "The relationship between these landscapes and the tourism industry is complex and often uneasy, in that the cultural landscape is an amalgam of public and private spaces upon which the tourism industry is often dependent, but over which the latter has little or no control. The tourism industry, however, benefits from these landscapes on a largely cost-free basis by not having to pay any rent to the owners of the scenery and other tourism resources. This can cause resentment on the part of residents, especially if elements of the tourism industry, such as accommodations and built attractions, become increasingly visible in the landscape and in their own right contribute to the degradation of its scenic quality. However," end quote. However, this concern is predicated on the assumption that tour operators have the most agency and that local communities are merely passive players in the tourism theater. In the case of the Amish, they have non-Amish business allies known as the English, who do the interfacing with outsiders. And because capturing revenue is important and we live in an age of disintermediation, it's more and more the case that local people are calling the shot. As an example, take a look at this website for the aeroponic facility in Lancaster that we visited. Not only do they have an official form for scheduling tours, which are available Monday through Friday from 10 to 3, but they cater to out-of-town visitors by giving 10% discounts at the Stoltzfus B&B, a lovely 19th century farmhouse. There's little worry that the Amish are being exploited. Far from being frozen in time by tourist expectations, the Amish maintain the look of the landscape and their own dress and traditional practices because it suits them. They are quite postmodern in that they pick and choose the elements of the past, present, and future that they want, and presented to the tourists not just as a way of making money as though they were living in a theme park, but in a deliberate attempt to influence the visitor. As they say on the website, quote, "We love talking about growing fresh, healthy food through aeroponics, and the best place for a discussion of aeroponics is standing in our greenhouse with a full view of the aeroponic system in action," end quote. Some people in the county also love discussing politics and religion, and there's little fear of cultural erosion occurring just because outsiders are visiting. On the contrary, tourism can provide a way for people in remote periphery areas to affect the outside world, showing off their best practices so as to protect their worldview against incursion by unsustainable practices from the urban core. What may have started out as circumstantial alternative tourism, or CAT, becomes a form of deliberate alternative tourism, or DAT. What seems to count most, according to Weaver, is whether the destination in question is wholly dependent on tourism, or whether it retains an identity outside of tourism that can keep it vibrant and help it maintain its integrity. For example, in many urban tourist areas, Weaver says, such as London, Paris, Sydney, Prague, and Washington, sustainable mass tourism, or SMT, is more easily achieved because, quote, "the main structural characteristic that distinguishes these urban places from tourism cities is the fact that the tourism accounts for only a small component of all economic activity within the city. Their spatial and symbolic distinctiveness, moreover, is not primarily influenced by tourism, which has a less visible impact on the cultural landscapes or community composition. The concept of applying the destination life cycle to London or Paris as a whole is untenable, and also because multiple factors and environments external to tourism will substantially influence the physical land spaces and attitudes of residents. Among other effects, the urban economy is not as likely to be universally depressed by seasonal fluctuations in the tourism sector," end quote, page 141. And this dynamic needn't only apply to big cities. The Amish are going to be Amish whether the tourists come or not. They've fought hard for the identity and landscape they maintain, and if anything, most members of their community will strive to turn tourism to their advantage as a way of influencing the outside world. And this can be true of indigenous groups as well. Weaver tells us on page 144 that, quote, "approximately 400 million people, or 7% of the world's population, are considered indigenous insofar as they are recognized as the original inhabitants of a particular area or the people who occupied that area prior to colonization by the current residents. Despite their relatively small numbers, however, they constitute a majority or a substantial minority within as much as 1/2 of the Earth's land area, particularly those places that many so-called ecotourists now want to visit." Some have felt that tourism would unequivocally have an erosive effect on their culture, even when it was part of a, quote, "strategy to overcome economic deprivation and initiate a cultural revival," as per the advocacy platform. When the political situation was not sustainable to begin with, for example, where there is high unemployment reflected through cultural discrimination, then, quote, "indicator benchmarks using the status quo are normally inappropriate since this would involve sustaining the unsustainable." This may include our application of sustainability indicators that measure percentage of land in protected areas, which is usually regarded as a good indicator of environmental quality, but which ignores the fact that certain ecological features, such as the availability of a wide variety of food-producing plants in a rainforest, for example, or the maintenance of biodiversity, is more often actually the result of historical good practices by indigenous groups interacting with nature in a sustainable way that most Western societies are still struggling to learn. Robinson, 1999, for example, quote, "regards this issue as an indicative of the conflict between indigenous tradition and the Eurocentric concept of environmentalism that has largely informed the sustainability debate. Eurocentrism is also evident in the assumption of Ehrlich-Klor and others that DAT, deliberate alternative tourism, is the option most sympathetic with indigenous communities," end quote, page 144. What if the natives are restless, though, and are no longer happy with the idea of having to dress up in grass skirts and juggle fire and luau's? What if they want to explore their own ways of creating sustainable mass tourism that embrace postmodern hybridity, such as we see with the Amish, creating their own pastiche of ancient and modern practices and dress codes? What if different players in the society want to do things differently? Weaver reminds us on page 145 that, quote, rightly or wrongly, it is commonly assumed that indigenous people are attuned to a communal or community approach to making decisions. However, this assumption must be reassessed, since some indigenous communities have also been associated with nepotism, clan rivalries, and other problems based on tradition or not that have negative implications for the sustainability of certain groups or individuals within those groups, end quote. Many of these problems, however, I see to be easier to deal with when the Eurocentric hegemony that is the legacy of colonialism is replaced by a simple overall respect for all people regardless of their ethnic or cultural heritage. For example, Robinson talks about the emerging permission to gaze model, in which indigenous people decide what is made available for tourist consumption and under what terms, so that their own version of an authentic and unsustainable or sustainable tourism experience is featured. End quote, page 145. Interestingly, this is what is happening in the island communities of the Amish. Islands because they're cultural pockets deliberately isolated from the broader American society, but where they are determining what authentic means. The big difference is that the Amish are a European indigenous group who, despite their desire to hold on to centuries-old traditions and resist government and corporate influence over their low-technology lifestyle, have not suffered the prejudices and structural impediments that plague people of color and those who suffered from the legacy of colonialism. On page 136, Weaver talks about Doxies' 1975 Iridex, or Irritation Index model of community responses to tourism, which suggests parallels with Butler's destination life cycle model. Like the S-curve, it starts out great, but doesn't end well, progressing through stages from euphoria, where visitors are welcome but there's little planning, that would be the circumstantial alternative tourism, to apathy, where visitors are taken for granted and contact becomes more formal, then on to annoyance, where saturation is approached and the local people begin to have misgivings while planners attempt to control the situation via increasing infrastructure rather than limiting growth, and finally antagonism, where the locals openly express their irritation. In this scenario, planning is remedial, but paradoxically, promotion of the destination is increased in order to offset the deteriorating reputation of the area and the decline in interest. End quote. Remember the movie Jaws and the dilemma the mayor of Amity Island faced after the first couple of shark attacks? It's kind of like that. The challenge, as Weaver points out in section 8.3.1, is that it's dreadfully hard to define precisely who the community is and who or what we're trying to save. He reminds us that many of the most vocal pro-tourism or con-tourism members of the community, quote, may actually account for only a small minority. Destinations usually contain several competing interest groups, and T. Manning, 1999, goes so far as to suggest that a community is little more than an agglomeration of competing special interest groups. The idea that successful advocacy groups are able to fulfill their vested interests reflects the broader truism, he says, that the costs and benefits from tourism within a community are not equally distributed, even in cases where alternative tourism is practiced. This complicates efforts to achieve consensus, which can be used as an indicator of sociocultural sustainability. During the era of the cautionary platform, Weaver says, the Iridex model of Doxie proposed that community attitudes progress uniformly from euphoria through to apathy, annoyance, and antagonism as tourism evolves through the destination life cycle. However, this notion of an evolving consensus has since been refuted by numerous investigations that reveal conflicting attitudes and community discord at all stages of development in all types of destinations, with those in favor of tourism typically being those who benefit from employment within the sector. An additional complication is that many residents acknowledge positive economic benefits from tourism at the same time that they express concerns about concomitant sociocultural and environmental costs. End quote, page 136. And those special interest groups also appeal to special interest groups in the tourist population. So, for example, some tourists may go to a coastal location, say in Australia, as part of the GCV or Gold Coast Visioning Project mentioned in the book, to surf and party, while others like me may go to study insect diversity in the rainforests of Lamington National Park, as I did on an Earthwatch expedition in 1995, while still others will visit the Jalurgal Aboriginal Cultural Center and have their faces painted and learn to throw boomerangs. Critics may contend that this last activity is not an authentic experience and that the Aborigines are now capitalizing on myths about their past, and when they go home for the day, they wash off their paint and wear trousers and go out drinking in the pubs of Brisbane rather than sit around the campfire and walk about Dreamtime. The same criticism is vituperatively launched against the recreated Maya city at the Xcaret Maya theme park in Cancun, with people saying it's totally contrived. But Lawton, 2001, found that the residents of the Gold Coast regard highly contrived and commercial specialized built attractions as contributing in a very positive way to their personal quality of life, end quote. While Weaver points out that, quote, tourism cities may be described as the consummate spatial expression of postmodernism, and they are also symbolically distinct in that their identity is inextricably linked to their emphasis on tourism and leisure. This is extremely significant from a sustainability perspective in that tourism is more of a basis for the destination's sense of place than an activity that has usurped a pre-existing identity. Theme parks and casinos, for example, often castigated as placeless intruders in other urban areas, are very much part of the identity of tourism cities such as Las Vegas, rather than necessarily a negative indicator, end quote, page 140. And so what is wrong with the idea of Australian Aborigines or the descendants of the Maya making a living engaging in their rituals in front of a paying public in a theme park or resort that recreates the architecture and environments of their past? Far from being erased by tourism, one could say that Indigenous people are getting a chance to bring their cultural influences to a larger slice of humanity. And since many of the cultural practices came out of the abundant leisure time that many Indigenous groups had, after all, anthropologist Marshall Solins called hunter-gatherer groups, quote, the original affluent society, couldn't it be argued that tourism's leisure activity, raison d'être, is the perfect place to continue the evolution of these practices? Destinations, Weaver tells us, are inherently complex places in which the pursuit of sustainability is critically influenced by factors such as cultural landscape, scale, boundaries, absolute and relative location, and the fact that all destinations are positioned within and influenced by a nested hierarchy of other destinations and the presence of permanent resident populations or communities, page 148. A Green Globe 21 community standard now accompanies the company standard featured in Chapter 7, based on a trajectory of involvement that begins with affiliate or awareness status and progresses to benchmarked and certified status. And given the complexities of human societies, the biggest difference between community standards and company standards in Green Globe is that community standards place, quote, greater emphasis on community consultation and participation and in formulating a sustainable tourism destination master plan with the community, page 148. But there's no goal as amorphous and subjective than sustainable tourism, Weaver reminds us, particularly since we live on a planet where every square inch is now a conceivable tourist destination. And destinations are a, quote, complicated amalgam of public and private sector components represented by numerous stakeholders ranging in their awareness and pursuit of sustainability from highly active to apathetic and even hostile, end quote, page 148. Now, certainly small islands are substantially overrepresented as tourist destinations, according to Weaver, with just 0.3% of the population, but 4.6% of all international stayovers, and tourism accounts for as much as 70% of the economy in small islands. Page 146. Also, these islands may be the most important battlegrounds for ecological sustainability, biodiversity preservation, and cultural distinctiveness because of the endemism and the species richness and the fragility that isolation over evolutionary time created. But it is perhaps because the entire world is now a tourist destination that we can have some hope to preserve these sensitive areas and hotspots. Is it beach you want? A clean, pristine beach? After I went to a very popular tropical beach party in the city of Munich, Germany one summer, on a completely false beach replete with coconut trees and lapping waves, and after I visited an ice skating rink on the outskirts of the slums of Manila in the Philippines, I realized that much of what tourists are craving can be contrived anywhere, and it may be possible to preserve endangered species and ecosystems and their services precisely by recreating the leisure aspects of fragile natural landscapes and cultures elsewhere. And if people want to eat farm-grown, sustainably harvested vegetables and watch people ride about in horse carts, or dance with face paint and throw boomerangs, then there's no reason these cultural practices and their landscapes can't expand outside of their original regions of origin. After all, if Europeans can turn most of America into a simulacrum of the English countryside with its lawns and brick buildings and English sparrows and sheep and cows, we can also turn parts of Europe into a land of teepees and bison. Tourism may have started circumstantially in certain areas, with explorers discovering a cool practice or a neat area and inviting others to visit as well. But when the demand grows, there really are only two ways to deal with it. One is to try to figure out how to preserve the destination while encouraging more and more visitors to check it out, trying to create a DAT, or deliberate alternative tourism, or ultimately an SMT, or sustainable mass tourism situation. Or you can try option 2, the option that I favor. Try to figure out how to create more and more places with the desirable characteristics of the original destination. At some point in our postmodern world, tourism may stop being a phenomenon where wealthy folks leave home to seek out a rare experience, but become rather a part of the normal nomadic lifestyle that most human beings engaged in since we began to walk upright, going, like Aborigines and other nomads, on walkabout, sharing songs and stories of where we've been and how we live and where we would like to go until we go on our final journey into dream time. And with that, I'd like to end with a quasi-spoken word poem I created, inspired by the Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss, going with this diagram about cat and dat and SMT and UMT, and I call it When Cat Turns to Dat. It goes like this. Circumstantial alternative tourism, CAT, is great, but it rarely sustains, so that sooner or later the crowds start to grow as the locale starts to cater to higher demand, causing harm to the land, so the way that things were, following Butler's S-curve, can no longer persist in a comfortable way. And that's where planning comes in, to try and save the day. If the cat goes to dat, well then, what's wrong with that? Circumstantial alternative tourism turning into deliberate alternative tourism. If you plan tourism well and you know where you're at, oh, the places you'll go. Oh, the things we'll create, if we can just take it slow, if we can achieve steady state. The danger, of course, is without strong regulation, that dat may turn into a UMT operation. That's unsustainable mass tourism, where the pressure on resources destroys destinations and where fixing the problem leads to only frustration. With spoiled beaches, high crime rates, those won't attract any tourists. Or just ask any Haitian. The desirable outcome is, of course, SMT, sustainable mass tourism, because there's no going back to when things were pristine. So we look for the best ways to handle the crowd, passing laws to tell tourists what's no longer allowed, closing nutrient loops and recycling, urging low-impact hiking, encouraging biking, and hoping green tourism is to everyone's liking. In some ways, it's easier to start with a place that has no real nature, no cultural face. A once vibrant city that's seen better days, like the new tourist district down in downtown LA, or out in the desert like the town of Las Vegas, where anything goes because what's contrived is what makes us come there. You see, tourists don't really know what sustainability means as long as a place has no crime and is clean and exciting to visit and at least somewhat green, with clean air to breathe and clean water for swimming. Authentic or man-made for most men and most women is only as important as the reaction they get when they're telling their friends where they went, who they met, what they did, what they bought. The Gold Coast of Australia is the textbook example where unremitting arrival threatens resources once ample with Butler's stagnation in what was once a surface paradise, now increasingly congested with high-rises and vice. But they've pulled in the hinterland with its quaint farms and rainforests to handle the spillover through a border now porous between UMT and DAT in a complex mosaic of hyper-tourism sprawl, because every place on Earth now heeds tourism's call, whether urban or rural or the fringe in between. The world is complex, but there's plenty to see if we just make a commitment to avoid UMT. Hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you'll use your creativity to bring Weaver's textbook to life so that everybody can enjoy thinking about and contributing to our dialogue about sustainable tourism. See you next time.